Hello everyone, and welcome back one and all to The Library is Open. So I hope you brought your library card, my darling. Card, my darling. Chin chin. As you can tell, what with the nights drawing in more and more, what is it now? It's like 5 to 6 now, and it's pretty much getting on for dark now, which is, I mean, it's actually fine. I kind of had this weird relationship with autumn and winter. I may have mentioned before where I really like them as seasons, but I don't think they like me very much in terms of, I guess, how I respond to them, like in my body, sort of thing. A little touch of sad, I think, maybe, due to the lack of sunlight, but it getting dark early doesn't really bother me too much, and it's, I'm sure I've said before, it's the perfect environment for cozying up with a book or several, isn't it? In the ongoing saga of my hair, it continues to grow. I mean, it's a look. So, so there we go. Actually getting less reading time at the moment, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know, because of work, because I'm working pretty much full time now. So I'm really valuing the time I get to read, but it has meant that sort of like how much I'm reading has gone down a little bit. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that does mean that I don't have to buy any new books. How's that working out for you, Crowther? Yeah, great. But it does feel like the perfect time of year for some really targeted reading. I don't necessarily do that in spring and summer per se, but I think in autumn and winter I do get the hankering for a very specific kind of book, or maybe a genre, or so on and so forth. And I thought with Halloween a coming, or a being, depending on when I upload this, spooky season feels like the time for a nice little gothic-y kind of chiller. But this being The Library is Open, there's always a twist on that. So I thought I'd go with a sort of spoof, if you will, of the gothic genre. And this is quite interesting because you'll have noticed that there are two books in this episode title, but they both have the same title. And that is for a very good reason, which I shall now reveal. So the first is Northanger Abbey by Jane Lovely Austen. I added the lovely in, it's not really that. In this beautiful vintage classics edition. It's gorgeous, isn't it? Just look at that. That's stunning. Look at those end papers. I had this sort of vague idea that I was going to get the full set of Jane Austens like this, and I may still yet, but I haven't as yet, but I might. And the second book is Northanger Abbey by Val McDermid. Now, this was a part of, they had an initiative called the Austen Project, where they had contemporary authors take one of Jane Austen's novels, of which there are the 6 main ones, so Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Persuasion, Emma, and Northanger Abbey, and then write a sort of contemporary response to it, or a reimagining. Unfortunately, I don't think the project did as well as they anticipated, because I don't think they did Mansfield Park, and maybe it was Persuasion. Let's find out, actually. I've got the computer right here. Let's find out. The Austen Project. Yeah, they didn't do Persuasion and Mansfield Park, which apparently is because it didn't do as well. Which is a real shame, because with 2 to go, it sort of feels like you might as well have just done them. But I haven't read the other contemporary adaptations, but I did pick up Val McDermid's because I thought this would make quite an interesting comparison. So, yeah, let's just go over the basic plot. So, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen is a sort of spoof of the Gothic genre, and our heroine is Catherine Morland, who's a very sort of sheltered girl who's grown up in a little village, and sort of very close to her family, but not particularly worldly. And she's quite bookish in the sense that she loves Gothic horror and romance and so on and so forth. So stuff like Mrs. Radcliffe's books, or, Castle of Otranto, things like that were popular at the time. And she gets taken to Bath for a sort of extended stay. Bath being the, you know, the kind of cultural place to go in Jane Austen's time. You know, you go to like the pump rooms or to, you know, the entertainments to see and be seen and so on and so forth. And for young women particularly, and young men, it was a good place to look for a potential partner. So she's taken there by Mrs. Allen, who is very sort of, she's a lovely character, but she's very sort of, in quite funny ways really, she's obsessed with clothes, so that's like her thing, that's what she thinks about constantly. Clothes and knowing people. There's a little bit of satire going on there from Jane Austen already. Obviously Jane Austen, famous satirist, who, you know, just spoofed this sort of middle to upper classes mercilessly, which is wonderful to read. And when she's there, she becomes enamoured of a young man called... Well, she makes a friend first, Bella Thorpe, whose brother, John Thorpe, falls in love with her, apparently, but she's really not interested in him. He's a bit of what nowadays would be a bit of a sort of... you know, he's a bit of a try-on, bit of a lads kind of guy, who's obsessed with, like... you know, sort of kind of thrill-seeking and stuff like that, and he's very badly behaved towards women and so on and so forth. Rather, she actually prefers Henry Tilney, who is a young man she meets with his sister, and their father is a general, and she's sort of like, well, John's trying to sort of get with her. I'm aware that's not how it would have been, so it's dancing in the pump room basically, rather than, you know, any sort of contemporary get with her kind of thing. She's just interested in Henry, but he sort of engineers several mishaps whereby there's a lot of like misunderstandings, and at the same time, because she's really good friends with his sister, they share this sort of love of horror books and gothic romances and stuff like that, so they sort of G each other up to wishing that, you know, their lives reflected those kind of novels, you know, that level of excitement. Anyway, what happens is that Bella Thorpe falls apparently in love with Catherine's brother, and they plan to be married. Well, they get engaged and they have to ask permission and so on and so forth. But then it transpires that all is not as it seems there, and Henry Tilney has another brother with whom Isabella Thorpe becomes involved, if you will, and then there's tears before bedtime. But prior to that, Catherine is invited to Henry and his sister's house called Northanger Abbey, where she meets their father, the general, who she is sort of quite a bit afraid of. And when she's staying at the Abbey, she realises, or rather, she comes to think of it as like this sort of really uber gothic location, and she starts to imagine all sorts of things that might have happened. It transpires that the Tilneys' mother passed away, and she gets it into her head that maybe their father had something to do with it. So she starts sort of investigating around the castle, and she sort of really sees herself as like the heroine of this real life gothic story. And then in the background, we've got all these sort of relationship dramas going on between the various characters in their various configurations. And it's whether Catherine can A, solve the mystery of what's actually happening at Northanger Abbey, or whether she can't, and whether this will jeopardise her potential relationship with Henry in any way. So that's basically the plot. And in the Val McDermid version, which is the contemporary reimagining, the plot is entirely the same. It's just updated, which kind of surprised me a little bit, but not in an unpleasant way. I was sort of thinking, oh, maybe it would be sort of like variations on a theme, but it would spin off somewhere else. But no, instead of Bath, it's the Edinburgh Festival, which is actually a stroke of genius, because it's probably the nearest we have to what that's the sort of season at Bath would have been, but in like modern society. Not now, obviously, with everything that's going on this year, but as a general rule. And so Northanger Abbey is transplanted to the Scottish borders, and John Thorpe becomes like a proper sort of lads wide boy who's into fast cars and a bit Top Geary. And instead of gothic romances, Kat's sort of literature drug of choice is like vampire novels, basically. There's a sort of invented series in here called Hebridean Harpies, but she makes a lot of reference to things like Twilight and stuff like the Vampire Diaries and so on and so forth. And she begins to imagine that the general, and indeed the family, might actually be vampires, and that they're either keeping the mother prisoner, or she's been killed by them, or maybe she was a vampire and they're not actually related. She doesn't know anyway. But essentially the setup is exactly the same, with the character of Mrs. Allen, who's obsessed with clothes, is still obsessed with clothes in this one and being seen as like a socialite. Bella Thorpe is quite vacuous and flirty, and she sort of talks in text speak and so on and so forth. So it's really just a faithful retelling of the story, but with those contemporary elements. So what's really interesting about Northanger Abbey is that actually it was the first novel that Jane Austen ever wrote, and it was accepted for publication, but then it never actually got published in her lifetime. So she ended up reacquiring the rights and buying them back. I think she wrote quite a caustic journal entry about it at the time, which is included in the preface to this edition of Northanger Abbey. And it's really interesting because it's very unlike a lot of her other novels. In fact, Val McDermid, there's a little mini interview in the back of her adaptation where she talks about how different it is, because she says that, and in some ways I get what she means. She says that it has more in common with the contemporary novel than it does her other novels, which is really interesting, especially considering it was her first novel. There's a real love of the sort of kind of affectionate ribbing of the Gothic genre as well. It's like Jane Austen lampoons it, no holes barred, but I mean it's played very much not for nastiness or full on critique, but more sort of like spoofy kind of ho 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 behind your fan kind of thing, Ho 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 behind your fan, that'd look great on a t-shirt, wouldn't it? If they ever do merch, that's what it's going to be. Another really interesting thing about Northanger Abbey in both editions is that actually the abbey itself is both important and not. It's important in the sense that it sort of brings to like the forefront the issues that have been going on in the background, vis-a-vis like Kat or Catherine's naivety and her sort of fanciful imaginings, and it does provide that sort of, it kind of has that name, doesn't it? You feel like you should say it like Northanger Abbey sort of thing, and there's going to be like a corpse in the rhododendron or something. There's not, spoiler. But it actually doesn't make an appearance in the book until very late on. In both books, it's like pretty much the last major plot point that happens. Where does she... yeah, because like we're nearing the 200-page mark by the time that Catherine actually gets to Northanger Abbey. And then the plot sort of revolves very quickly in this sort of like Deus Ex Machina. Deus Ex Machina, sorry. Why did I say Deus Ex Machina? That's not even a phrase. Deus Ex Machina, that sort of really quick, sort of, as if by magic miracle, sorts everything out. But again, that is in tribute to the Gothic genre. So it's really very clever. It's quite meta in some respects. It's just really interesting that something as... that gives the book its title actually doesn't appear until quite later on. But then I suppose what we could say is that actually everything's been building up to Northanger Abbey, and that actually it's less about the house itself and more about what it represents as like an idea or an abstract concept. So maybe there's something in that. I still can't believe I mispronounced that then. Anyway, move on. So that's interesting. I think that I was looking around because apparently there has been an adaptation of... I think there's been an adaptation of Northanger Abbey. Let me just check that. But I haven't seen it. Northanger Abbey TV. Oh yeah, there was. So, 2007, a TV movie. I might have to watch that then. So I'd be really interested to see how a sort of adaptation of this deals with it, because, you know, particularly in the original, but also in the contemporary one as well, there's a lot about books in terms of, you know, you kind of have to buy into this particular style of reading or a bit of, like, knowledge of what that genre is, and it's very much about what literature can do to in terms of... you know, affecting how you view the world and sort of colouring your judgment on things. So it's be really interesting to see it in like a performed format, as it were, because obviously that doesn't really translate in the same way. So I'll be interested to see how they handle that, particularly the sections that deal with, you know, the books and Catherine's thoughts on reading them. So, but yeah, there's a lot to like in both versions of the books. I think it would come down to, if I'm being really honest, when you would prefer to read the story. Because I don't think, unless you particularly want to, I don't think you need to read both. Because, as I say, they are literally, and this is not a criticism, but they are literally the same story. Exactly the same story. And that's actually a real credit to Val McDermid, because she also says in the interview at the back that she went through a lot of permutations of like the opening couple of chapters to try and sort of key into that Jane Austen style. You know, that means that she can use contemporary language, but she can sort of mimic, I guess, the rhythm or the tone and the shifts and so on and so forth of how Austen plots Northanger. But yeah, so as a point of curiosity, as I say, if you're interested in both, then by all means read both. But if you just want the story, then I would say go with when you would prefer to read it. You know, the sort of Regency or I say the modern day. Wait, how old is this now? This was 2014, so it's like 6 years old, the contemporary version. But both equally good, and both they both hold up. There's maybe an argument saying that the level of incredulity from Catherine is more believable in Jane Austen's version versus, you know, a more sort of contemporary heroine. Although in the Val McDermid book, she does make like Catherine's character more sort of excitably naive as opposed to completely naive. So it's more about that she's sort of, because she does have social media and so on and so forth. So it's not like she's not aware of how the world works, but she's just very bookish and she lives in a village, a little Dorset village with her dad who's a vicar, and they don't have, you know, sort of regular access to, you know, all the sort of online things, although she does have it on her phone. But, so that kind of works, I guess. But as I say, it's more believable than that. Oh, one thing that also is different as well, the sort of denouement where we discover more about the General's character. Val McDermid has put a different twist, which actually feels right, on the reason that he behaves as he does. It makes a lot more sense. And actually what Val McDermid also does is give more justification for the characters behaving as they do than Jane Austen does. So like in Jane Austen, people behave badly or foolishly, and they just behave badly or foolishly, whereas in Val McDermid we get a little bit more of, I guess, justification for the characters and a bit more of their backstory, not excessively, but things that might explain their motivations. But that's quite a contemporary thing, isn't it, to look more at the why as opposed to the what, I think, in novels, because I think we're more invested in like well-rounded characters that are not archetypes. So yeah, and don't worry as well, even though it's like gothic-y spoofy, it's not scary at all. Neither of them are scary. So if you fancy a little bit of sort of fun fun, gothic ghoulish for the Halloween season, then you wouldn't go too far wrong there. Though if you're looking for pure, full-out horror or supernatural or anything, these are probably not the books for you. But there we go. So that was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen and Northanger Abbey by Val McDermid. I must read some more Val McDermid, actually, because I did enjoy reading this in her writing style. I did enjoy her writing style when reading this, and I know she has a heck of a lot of novels in crime, which, as you know, is like my catnip. So I should definitely do get round to that at some stage. So do let me know your thoughts. If you read Northanger Abbey, if you've seen the TV movie, is it one of those sort of lesser known Jane Austens for you that you've not really sort of engaged with, or maybe you've read the contemporary version? Let me know. Or perhaps you would, you'd like to let me know what you're reading this Halloween season. Spooky Halloween and all that business. So, thank you so much for joining me. The library is now closed, so put those cards away somewhere safe, won't you? And spray them with a disinfectant just to be safe. Thank you as always for watching, liking and commenting, I said in anticipation. And do please take care of yourselves and stay safe out there. Alright, until next time, much love. Mwah.